Aloha and welcome to our webinar on healing and grief. My name is Dr. Misty Sagas. I'm the Program Director at Mental Health America of Hawaii. Today, we're going to be looking at and just quickly reviewing some of the statistics on grief, looking at the different aspects of it and how it has an impact on us as individuals. We'll be looking at helpful self care tips and then talking about how you can support someone who is in a healing process and what community resources are available. I'd like to start by practicing a coping skill, and it's called diaphragmatic breathing. The reason I like to start this presentation with diaphragmatic breathing is because it can be difficult. For some people who are watching this, you're in an active grieving process and you don't often have the time to just take a couple of minutes out of your day to do some deep breathing and just to reground and recenter. So that's what we're going to do. If you're familiar with diaphragmatic breathing, please feel free to start engaging in some of that while I'm speaking, but if you're not, I'm going to walk you through the process. So what you're simply going to do is take a hand and put it on your diaphragm. If you're not familiar with where that is, your pinky should be resting right around the belly button area. You're going to take a second hand and put it on the upper portion of your chest. Now, typically we breathe shallowly from our upper chest and we don't get enough oxygen. So this is just taking a few minutes to think about pulling in deeper breaths and pulling them from the diaphragm. So as we inhale, we're going to inhale through our nose, exhale through our mouth, and focus on moving that diaphragm hand more than the hand on the upper chest. Feel free to get comfortable in a nice seated position, keeping your eyes open or closed, whatever is comfortable, and take in that first deep breath. Now you're going to hold that for as long as is comfortable. And when you're ready to exhale, slowly exhale out through your mouth. Taking another deep breath, pulling that in from your diaphragm, holding for as long as is comfortable, and slowly exhaling out through your mouth. The reason I like diaphragmatic breathing is when we over oxygenate our systems, it helps us feel more relaxed. This is a tool that you can use. You don't need anything additional, and you can do it pretty much anywhere. So it's very effective. It's one of my favorite ones to use. When we do our presentations, I typically do like to start with a quote, and this is one that was shared with me from a psychologist here in Hawaii. And I think it's so beautiful to put into context some of the things we'll be talking about. It's by Washington Irving, and it says, "There's a sacredness in tears. They are not the mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are the messengers of overwhelming grief, of deep contrition, and of unspeakable love." What a beautiful way to start into our presentation. I think that the reason I like to talk about the statistics of grief, A, I love research, but also B, it kind of opens the door and gives us a peek at what the experience is for so many people. So, about 2.5 million people pass in the US each year, leaving on average about 5 people to grieve. That number is higher when you have someone who has passed away by COVID-19. They're saying that it's about 9 people that are affected for each loss to COVID-19. About 1.5 million children have a parent that have passed away. In a recent web survey, 57% of people said, "Yes, I am actively grieving." In 2017, the New York Life Foundation for Bereavement had a study and they found that 60%, over half of us believe that grief is a private matter. 45% said, "I'm not comfortable talking about grief." And 63% actively avoided talking to someone about their loss. So you can see how many people are grieving, trying to heal, and not getting the support they need, and how many of us aren't able to provide that support because we don't know. When we think about grief, we often think about the death of someone, the loss of someone, but this actually, at the core of it, is just loss, the loss of something or someone. If you have a pre-existing history of trauma, sometimes a previous loss will connect to a current loss, and then it's much stronger because those two things can absolutely connect. When we go into our healing process, we have whatever we have. We have whatever self care we had in place. We have whatever coping skills we were using. And it's important to know that it can be difficult to find the time to learn new skills when you're already actively grieving. We always like to talk about the fact that people cope differently. What works for you might not work for me, and vice versa. We also know that people grieve differently, and we should honor that process. There's different causes for why people grieve. This is an extraordinarily short list, and it could be very long. But just to highlight a few of those reasons, could be the loss of someone, could have a loved one that has died by suicide or transition in a relationship like divorce, a diagnosis of chronic or terminal illness, loss of a pet or a job, and loss of a cherished item like a family home. There's so many things that we cherish and love that we can lose that can cause grief. We can talk about different models of grief, but I think the one that comes up the most is the Kubler-Ross model. I don't like to talk about it in terms of like this is a definite, this is going to happen, each one of these stages in this order, because it's not actually what the research shows. This is more of a conversation and a check-in model to say, are these are things that I'm experiencing, such as denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Some people do talk about these different emotions. They say, yes, in the beginning, was in denial that this was happening. I was in shock, or I was angry that this was going to happen and there was nothing I could do. I felt very hopeless and out of control. I bargained. I said, if I did this, can this be the outcome? I felt sad and depressed. I was in grief, active grief. Or I moved into a place in my process that I could accept that this was what had happened and this was the transition my life was going to go through. There are so many other ways that people can experience this, but this is just a few of the ways. This is a model on the course of grief, and I actually, as simple as it seems, I actually really like it. It talks about the fact that when you first have a loss of any sort, that there's this aspect of feeling numb, that you're kind of again in that shock. You're kind of working through how that feels to you and really struggling with accepting it. And then you move into the pining, the longing stage, longing to have that connection, that relationship again, longing to have that thing that you lost back in your life. And then that longing leads to feelings of sadness and despair. And that all those things, they kind of collectively pull together and start to disorganize your life. It's very difficult to do the day to day, to go to activities and do big projects that really you just start to think, I need to slow down. I need to ground and take time for myself. And it just, things seem really hard. They seem really hard to do. And so that's how we start to disorganize. And then at some point in our own individual way, we start to reorganize. And we're going to talk about what that can look like when we reorganize. Before we move into that, I would like to highlight the fact that crying can be a crucial part of your grieving process. But again, there are individual differences, and it's okay not to cry. That somebody can lose someone and have, a very deep healing process and cry frequently throughout it, and then a few years later lose someone else and not cry ever. And it doesn't mean that you were closer to one person than the other or that one healing process was more effective than the other. It just means individual differences. Every loss is different and every moment in time is different. And so give yourself grace to be able to say, this is how it happened for me. This is how I'm making sense for me, and that's okay. I think that we often talk about the emotional and psychological effects of grief, and we don't talk enough about the physical symptoms, because the physical symptoms can also look like medical issues. It can be fatigue, loss of appetite, headaches, body aches, stomach pain, and heart palpitations. If you are having these symptoms and you are in a grief process, check in with your primary care physician, check in with your doctor, and say, this is what I'm feeling. I am in an active grieving process. I have lost whatever that is or whoever that is for yourself. I just need to check in to make sure everything's okay. The reason I say that is because I would not want you to dismiss these symptoms and assume that it is part of your grief process, because we also know that anxiety and stress can increase symptoms for medical issues. And so you can see that really close connection between the body and the heart and the brain. And we just want to make sure that everything's okay. Some of those mental health things that you look for are things like sadness and depression, sleep issues and anger, anxiety, and even for some people, suicidal thoughts. With COVID-19 impacting how we choose to grieve and how we're able to get the support, we know that there's issues with separation distress, the separation from our support systems, separation from the person that we loved that has transitioned in some way. We know that there can be dysfunctional grief. And it's not my favorite terminology. I like to kind of refer it to more as disrupted grief, that we had an idea of what our grieving and healing process would look like because of different the things around COVID-19, different like safety regulations. Maybe we weren't able to do that. Maybe we weren't able to celebrate the life to get the support around it that we needed, how we would normally get it. And so that can definitely disrupt our process and make it longer. And with all the things that our communities have been facing, that post-traumatic stress could be part of your experience. And if it is, we're going to talk about some places you can go to get support. Let's look at different self-care tips. I think that there's a plenty of self-care tips that we could talk about, but these are really specific to healing. When we look at these, what I want you to think about is how we will ground, recenter ourselves, how we would take time to heal, and then the concept of just comfort. Comfort overall is what's really going to help us feel supported emotionally. So make sure your sleep is good. It's the most restorative thing you can do. So we're going to talk about that actually in depth in just a few minutes. Reconnect to nature, get that good sunshine time, and then unplug from technology because it's very easy to distract yourself. And I'm not saying that that's not effective. It can be, but the difference between watching a funny show for 2 hours because your heart needed it versus binge watching something you're not even interested in for 2 weeks because it's really hard to feel what you need to feel. It's different. So really think about that as you're working on your self-care. It can be helpful to lean into mastered skills. I myself have gone through many grieving processes. Unfortunately, that's a uniqueness of my life trajectory. And I found that leaning into my skills was really helpful. Where do I feel mastery? Where do I feel in control? And so that could be for you a hobby, a sport, things like gardening. Aromatherapy is a great one to look at because senses can help relax us or revitalize us. And that's a nice thing to be able to have. Also, there's your comfort, cozy blankets, relaxing sounds, warm beverages. Taking care of something, whether that's a plant, pet, or person, actually makes us feel good when we are in need of that same comfort. We're comforting something. Do those great nourishing meals, get that good gentle exercise like stretching and yoga. Journal if you feel like you need to think more about what your experiences are. Try visualization exercises and sharing your feelings if that is helpful for you. Try not to isolate, and within your faith system, whatever it may be, make sure that you're engaging in it and making meaning out of what has happened. Go for a walk and try to see if you're having a hard time keeping motivated and keeping consistent, whether or not an activity buddy could be a good idea. Here in Hawaii, it's beautiful. It's a beautiful place. And so I like to hike. And remember calling a friend of mine saying, I just need to get out in nature. And so we termed ourselves the Muddy Buddies, and we would go out rain or shine. Most oftentimes it was rain. And we would do these things together to provide support to each other. And so that can be a nice way to have accountability, still stay safe, and still stay active, engaged with your support system. There are coping skills that you can learn. It is a little bit more difficult when we're already stressed to learn them. But just like diaphragmatic breathing, you can take 5 minutes and learn a new skill that could absolutely work for you. We know being present focused, meditating, practicing mindfulness, and radical acceptance can all work really well for someone who is in a healing process. And then by attending something like today, you increase your grief and mental health literacy. And even if you're not actively going through a grief and healing process, you're able to better support people who are. When we're talking about sleep, it's so crucial to make sure that you try as much as possible to maintain good sleep. You stay on that schedule. If you need to create new rituals around it, do so. Make sure you keep that wind down time really clear of other distractions and that things are really comfortable bedding, calming scents, cool temperatures. Again, no distractions with our electronics. If you need to, use those relaxation techniques and try to get that sunlight and exercise in during the AMs. Try not to eat or do alcohol and nicotine consumption too close to the PMs, and limit that napping. And if you have a lot of racing thoughts that are really great ideas, it's really nice to keep like notebooks near you so that you can just dump into them the thoughts or ideas that you can follow up on in the AM. The first year for someone who has lost someone can be difficult. That could be because of birthdays, holidays, or memorable days like anniversaries. It's good to think ahead of what those days are going to be and then plan for them. Make sure that your support system knows. Think about what really nice rituals you would like to continue in a tradition of honoring them, or what new ones you would like to create. But do think about them for the first year. I'll be honest in saying it can be difficult any year, but that first year is really your first exposure to a difference. And so prepare for them. Oftentimes people get to a place in their process and think about, how do I want to have this legacy? How do I want to honor this life? And there's many different ways to do that. And this is just a couple. That could be having a sentimental item like a piece of jewelry, donating to a support or cause, having a living reminder like a garden, starting a new tradition, or maintaining or altering a pre-existing tradition. Getting together and sharing stories about that person that is part of your positive experience of their life, and then engaging in their favorite activities. But again, there are many, many more. We talk a lot about the disruption, the disorganization that this can go through and that could cause into our lives. But there's a lot of positives that we can take away. That could be an appreciation for life, having an increased empathy because your experience is just like theirs. And so you understand just a little bit of how difficult that can be. That no matter what your faith system is, from, for example, atheism to being Wiccan, that it helps you make meaning out of your loss. It helps you make meaning as to what is important to you. It gives you that sense of purpose. And then, of course, other positives would be it helps you connect with your support system, and it really clarifies. It's like a refiner's fire. It really clarifies what is important to you, what you value, and what is not so important. And those are lessons that you will carry forward with you for a lifetime. If you are in need of support, this is what can be helpful to look for in that support system. Someone who listens and who is not judgmental, who lets you talk about your experience and does not try to fix it, and that they offer advice when you ask them for advice, and that they can hear your experience without minimizing it. If you are someone who is providing support to someone, the first step is this, is really making sure that you have strong grief and mental health literacy. Don't use platitudes. And if you hear yourself saying at least or it could have been worse, stop, back up, and just get back into where you were coming from, which is, I care about you. How can I support you? Because that's really where those phrases come from, is trying to help someone feel better and make ourselves feel like I know what to do in this moment, is to let them see that they can get through this, but it doesn't feel like that. And so I would recommend not using those phrases. Not sharing information without getting the permission of the primary caregivers is very important. Don't ignore the grieving person. Even if you're not sure what to say, just say that. I don't know what to say, but I really care about you and I'm here for you. Offer practical help. Say, I'm free on Tuesday. What can I do? Sometimes you're so overwhelmed, they're not sure. But if you're wanting to get real practical help, you can say, I'm going to the grocery store on Tuesday at 10 a.m. Can I pick you up anything and drop it off? Right? They get to say yes or no, and they don't have to come up with anything. Be a good listener and acknowledge that everyone grieves differently, and let them have that sacred space to do that. And remember that grief, just like love, is a lifetime. So, not 3 months after, 6 months after, or 6 years after, do you say, okay, well, then that's done. You still honor the fact that, yep, they're going to love that person their whole life, and we're going to support them in that difference of a relationship as much as we can. There are some books that I recommend for children around grief, and that does include The Heart in the Bottle, The Rabbit Listened, The Boy, the Mole, The Fox, and the Horse, and The Fall of Freddie the Leaf for those children who are very nature cycle oriented. There are some resources for those of you in Louisiana. We have different ones for Hawaii, but I do recommend checking out these different websites. They have a wonderful compilation list on each one for all the different support groups, mental health professionals, and different organizations that offer different types of support and care for people going through grief processes. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I'm talking about this really important piece of our lives, which is healing, loving, and grief. And I think that when I talk about it, I often think that we're all going to go through that. If you love someone, it is likely that you will go through some type of grief. If you love something, that you will experience some type of grief and loss in your lifetime. And it's really important to figure out how to make some of that a little bit more out in the open and a little bit more supported than it has been historically. If you have any questions about anything that I talked about today, please feel free to reach out and email us at info@mentalhealthhawaii.org. But you have an amazing affiliate of Mental Health America here in Baton Rouge. Please feel free to reach out to them. They're so wonderful. And they actually invited us to come and share some of this information with you. So you can call them at that 225-929-7674. A big mahalo from Hawaii to you.